Hello and welcome, I'm the Rambling Director, and today we're finally at the 1943 version. This is the fourth film, chronologically speaking, in the Phantom filmography. This one is simply titled The Phantom of the Opera, unless you look at the title screen in the opening, in which case it's The Phantom of the Opera in Technicolor, which actually is kind of cool. This film stars Susanna Foster as Christine, Edgar Barrier as Raoul, Nelson Eddy as Anatole, and finally, Eric Claudin, the Phantom of the Opera himself, is played by one of my favorite actors of all time, Claude Rains. The first thing to praise in general about this movie is the gorgeous music. It's one of the only Phantoms where they show opera sequences that are just entirely unique. And they are beautiful opera sequences with lots of gorgeous, lush music played by a fantastic orchestra. They're wonderfully costumed and the set design is just brilliant. There's one piece of music in particular called Lullaby of the Bells, composed by Edward Ward. It's kind of a hard name to say. You can listen to the entire concerto Lullaby of the Bells on the Phantom Reviewer's channel. He's uploaded the entire thing in great quality. Highly recommend you check out the full piece of music. It's one of the most beautiful pieces of music I think that's ever been composed for a film. Arthur Lubin was the director, and he's best known as the creator of Mr. Ed. Yeah, that's right, the sitcom about a talking horse. He made a lot of great comedies, including a number of Abbott and Costello movies. He directed several films you probably know by name, such as The Incredible Mr. Limpet with Don Knotts, and the 1961 version of The Thief of Baghdad. He's also a rare example of a director from this time period we know was gay. Now, immediately we get a sense that we are in good hands with Arthur Lubin's direction, because the first scene of this movie is a masterclass. We open with Claude Rains in the opera orchestra. He's a violinist named Eric Claudin. We dolly out from Claudin to establish the orchestra. Next shot we see Anatole, played by Nelson Eddy, and then crane up to establish the chandelier. And by the way, this is the same gorgeous opera set built for the Chaney version in 1925. Next we crane over to meet John Wilkes Booth. What are you doing here? No. It's actually Inspector Raoul d'Albert, played by Edgar Barrier. That's right, there's actually two Raouls in this version. A detective named Raoul, which is kind of a little homage to the book where Raoul sort of becomes a detective character, and Anatole, the opera baritone, played by Nelson Eddy. And yes, if you've never heard of Nelson Eddy, the singer / actor, that is his real voice. And it is beautiful. Now, a lot of people think this is not really a love triangle, but more of a love square between Christine, the Phantom, Raoul, and Anatole, but it's a little more complicated than that, but we'll get to that later. First, let's get back to this first scene, because, again, it's just a masterclass in filmmaking. We see Raoul reacting skeptically to Anatole's singing, establishing that the two men don't see eye to eye about something. We're about to find out what. During the performance, Anatole sings facing off stage, looking at and singing to Christine Dubois, who is clearly interested in him. Biancaroli, the film's Carlotta equivalent, sees Christine and is obviously jealous. We cut back to the orchestra to see the conductor noticing that Claudin is missing notes on his violin. Anatole then gives a big finish. So, without a word of spoken dialogue, we have established all of the characters and their intrapersonal conflicts, without a single word. I was recently told in a comment on one of my other YouTube videos that I was wrong for saying film is a visual medium. I have to kindly disagree though, and maybe it's because I grew up with a lot of silent films and this commenter didn't, or maybe it's just because I see sound design as a wonderful asset, and music as a wonderful asset. However, in my personal opinion, if music and sound design make your scene, if all it is dialogue and sound design with no visuals undercutting or underlaying the dialogue and the sound design, then you've just made a radio show with pretty pictures, not cinema. This is cinema. The music is beautiful to listen to, sure. However, in a way, it's almost superfluous to the scene besides circumstantially being there. They're at an opera, after all. All of the actual relationships, characters, and conflicts are gotten across solely by what you see. And again, growing up with a lot of silent movies, I just appreciate that that is the purest form of cinema. It's what cinema originally was, and what I think it, at its best, is meant to be. We get another few shots here to establish Anatole and Raoul's dislike for each other, and now we see the problem. They both love Christine. We don't even know their characters' names yet, and yet we have all the conflicts down pat. Again, we don't need a Christopher Nolan monologue about it. We can get it just by seeing it, if you're clever enough to direct it in a way that shows us. Christine misses a curtain call to go backstage and talk to Raoul.
You've had your fling at this for 2 years.
But I don't want to give up the opera, not until I've had a chance to really sing.
I find it really funny that both the 1925 Raoul, played by Norman Carey, and this Raoul in 43, played by Edgar Barrier, have lines where they effectively tell Christine that she's had her try at this whole opera thing and now she needs to get back in the kitchen. It's really quite funny, especially looking at it from this time period. It's like, whew, man, how much things have changed. We find out that this is not the only time this has happened. She meets with the conductor/director, who tells her that she has to choose between a career and an ordinary life.
But you must choose between an operatic career and what is usually called a normal life, though why it is so called is beyond me. You can't do justice to both.
Notice how the conductor actually seems to be pushing her toward the career rather than a family life. That's pretty uncommon for a 1943 movie. Christine meets Claude outside, and they have this odd interaction. But before I tell you about it, or show you any clips, you need a touch of history about this film. In the original shooting script, they pulled a major switcheroo plot twist that, if it had been included, might have changed the course of Phantom movies forever. You see, the original version of this film had a plot twist at the end, where it turned out Éric Claude was not in love with Christine, he was her father. Dun, dun, dun. This paternal twist and explanation was filmed, and then left out of the final cut which premiered to audiences. What apparently happened was, after watching a rough cut, producers thought it implied an incestuous attraction from Claude for his daughter. If you made this today, you'd easily be able to reframe your thoughts in light of the twist. But twists were not very common in the 1940s, so they probably just thought the audience wouldn't fully get it. This left Claude's love for Christine ambiguous in the final film. Unfortunate, really, because Claude never really acts like he's sexually attracted to Christine. He acts like he's a dad who doesn't know how to interact with his kid after decades of estrangement. Maybe you see romance here, but I don't, and never have. And honestly, without this twist, it makes Claude look like a freaking weirdo, even by Phantom of the Opera standards. Claude Rains has been a romantic lead many times, but he just never acts like this. Besides, there's a ton of hints that he's just not interested in her for romantic reasons.
A man of your age might win a young girl like Christine Dubois, if he happened to be the director of an opera company, but a poor violinist...
Signor, we agreed never to discuss my motives.
And even more reasons to believe that he is related to Christine in some way, shape, or form.
What was that, Claude?
A little song. A lullaby. From Provence, where I was born.
It's a lullaby of Provence. I've known it all my life.
You'll stay here with me, my child, won't you? It's been so lonely without you. Come now, my little one.
So for the rest of this analysis, I'm going to be treating it as if that subplot remained in the film. Maybe that's not fair, but honestly it makes a lot more sense of the character's motivations, and in particular, the way the Phantom acts throughout the film.
You went on the stage tonight for the third act curtain calls.
Everyone in the theater seems to have noticed it.
You weren't ill, were you? You're not in any trouble. But
you're very kind.
Claude enters the director's office and is asked to play on the violin, and he gives us our first sample of that gorgeous Lullaby of the Bells concerto. Claude says it's a lullaby from Provence, where he grew up. Claude then reveals that he's developing an issue with his left hand, probably arthritis, and is dismissed from the orchestra. And we keep getting little lines about how working at the Paris Opera as an orchestra member, he must have made so much money that he can retire comfortably. But Claude keeps giving these little knowing, like, yeah, sure, sort of expressions.
You've been with us a long time, haven't you?
20 years.
In appreciation of your long service, I shall arrange with the directors to have a season ticket issued to you.
20 years of service and all you get is a season pass. Ouch! Claude goes home and we get a reiteration from his housekeeper how rich he must be with his hoards of wealth, but he won't pay her rent on time. In the next scene, Claude comes to Christine's singing teacher and begs him to keep teaching her until he can get more money together. Now what we've learned from the last two scenes is that Claude has been investing all of his money in Christine's music education. He pays for her to have the best lessons in Paris, and to do this, he eats very little and lives in a cheap, decrepit apartment. In fact, he even eats the same soup every day, and the housekeeper says that he's starving himself. Now just to reiterate again, this is something I would do for my daughter. It is not something I would do for a woman that I had a crush on that I'd only seen from a distance, maybe said 2 words to, and just thought she was pretty. I would not be doing that for somebody that I just had a crush on, but I would be doing that for my child. So again, it just makes way more sense of the character's motivations. He tells the singing teacher that he's written a concerto, and he's going to publish it to buy Christine more lessons. Claude goes to the publisher, Familial, and anxiously waits all day to hear news about his manuscript and whether or not it will be published. He overhears the publisher's partner playing Claude's concerto with Franz Liszt? What are you doing here? Oh, wait a second, that is Franz Liszt. They just put him as a character in the movie. Yeah, his identity as a famous composer is not really used as part of the plot or anything. They just kind of make the famous Franz Liszt into a character in the movie. It's really odd. Now, I've heard people say that Claude is stupid for jumping to this conclusion so quickly. But I'm going to show you a couple clips here, and I want you to really watch how the music publisher acts and tell me that upon hearing your music being played in the next room, you wouldn't assume the same thing.
Well, I'm sorry, but I don't know where it is.
Oh, but it must be here.
Did we ask you to bring your music to us, Claude? Perhaps some employee has thrown this one into the wastebasket where it belongs.
That's my music.
I thought I told you to get out.
Thief. You've stolen my music. Thief!
He snaps and kills Familial, and again, his motivation just makes way more sense here if the plot twist had been left in the movie. Remember, in this version, the Phantom is sympathetic, not an escaped maniac like Chaney's Phantom. Claude's snapping makes way more sense when you consider he's lost the job that lets him see his daughter every day, the job that allowed him to pay for her lessons to further her career, and now he won't be able to further her career, meaning that all the work he put into her, if it's not finished, basically meant he wasted all that money and time. And finally, his life work, based on the lullaby he sang for her, more on that in a minute, has apparently been stolen. Yeah, I can kind of see why he snaps. After killing the publisher, his assistant throws a tray of acid in Claude's face. And Claude Rains' acting here is amazing. He acts like he's genuinely in agony. Now, a bit Phantom history here. I mentioned this in the Song at Midnight review, but some of you might not have seen it. You see, most of the Phantom's filmic history has not been about a man born deformed, like in the novel and subsequent Andrew Lloyd Webber musical. No, the majority of the Phantom's cinematic history has been that of an acid-scarred or burned musician who has to hide his disfigurement. Most people think that Claude Rains was the first acid-scarred Phantom. However, as we covered in the last episode of Phantom Through the Years, actually it was Song Dan Ping in Song at Midnight who originated the acid-scarred musician subplot. Claude hides in the sewer. And we meet the new managers as they deal with multiple thefts around the opera, obviously done by Claude. We also get multiple shots from here on of the Phantom's shadow on the wall. Remember, the Chaney Phantom was only 18 years old at this point, and so a lot of people, Arthur Lubin included, probably remembered that image of Chaney's shadow on the wall to build up kind of the anticipation for him to show up in the flesh, and so they use a lot of those sort of shots in this movie. Way more than the Chaney film did, actually. The managers are mainly comic relief in this version, and they don't get much screen time beyond this scene, with a few exceptions where they're kind of background characters. Christine meets Anatole in her apartment and plays Lullaby of the Bells on her piano. She mentions it being a lullaby from Provence, and that she's known this lullaby her whole life. Again, this is an implication that Claude sang her this lullaby as a child, and it's all that she remembers of him now.
A lullaby from Provence, where I was born.
It's a lullaby of Provence. I've known it all my life.
In the theatrical release, this is never really addressed. She just knows the same lullaby that the Phantom does, and it's never explained how. Now, remember I said we had two Rauls, Raul and Anatole. That makes a lot of sense if the Phantom isn't romantically interested in Christine. So although many people call this a love square rather than a love triangle, it's really not. It's still a love triangle between Anatole and Raul and Christine, because Eric loves Christine but as a dad. He's not challenged by her two suitors. Also, look, I've talked before about how Norman Carey's dress and visual as Raul would influence later generations of Rauls, and it turns out Raul and Anatole, if you look at them, they both look just like Norman Carey, right down to their little pencil mustaches. It turns out that Claude had stolen a bust of Christine that Anatole made.
That old scoundrel Claude must have stolen it.
Why?
Claude probably fell in love with her.
This line sets up the twist. You expect that answer. Unfortunately, it may also be the only line to give the incest impression, so maybe they should have cut that out and left the twist. And we have to set up some more romantic tension between our two love-sworn enemies.
After you, monsieur. After you, monsieur.
Christine hears the Phantom's voice in her dressing room and feels worried and uncertain. Immediately after, Anatole says the exact same thing to her, which is really weird. Like, that's an odd bit of writing, isn't it?
You're going to be a great and famous singer. I'll help you.
You're going to be a great and famous singer. I'll help you.
Because they didn't really need to do that. It's just kind of there, and they never really explain it. Like, the odds of him saying the exact same phrase to her must be 1,000,000 to 1, and yet it's just kind of there. I don't really know why it's there. It doesn't mislead us to the audience because we've met Eric Claude. It doesn't even mislead Christine, really. It's not even a red herring to her because Anatole immediately is like, well, I don't mean I actually said it, but I've been saying that to you forever. That night, Carlotta is drugged during a performance, right on stage in front of everyone, and Christine takes her place as understudy. She's a sensation, and it's here that we see Susanna Foster's incredible singing voice. And yes, it's really her. She's one of the only Christines to do her own operatic singing. I love this lonely shot of Eric hearing his daughter's debut, alone far below the stage, yet he remains standing the whole time. It's oddly touching. Biancaroli tries to bring charges against Anatole and Christine for drugging her, and I like how the managers deal with her.
That your career is bound to the Paris Opera. Whatever scandal injures us or any member of the company will injure you as well.
Biancaroli says she's willing to forget the charges if everyone forgets that Christine was a sensation. Now this is another little nugget of Phantom history for you. Biancaroli takes the place of Carlotta, and Carlotta was a small character in the book. She barely has a line, and she's just kind of there as the woman that the Phantom is getting out of the way to make room for Christine. She croaks like a toad on stage, and the chandelier falls, and then later on she's threatened to leave town so that she won't be interfering anymore. However, she's not a big character in the books, and there's no rivalry between Christine and Carlotta. However, mainly because of the influence of the musical, a lot of us think about Carlotta and Christine as being sworn enemies, who have this great tension between them based on who is the most talented singer. But that actually was not in the book at all. It wasn't even in the 25 Phantom. In fact, Carlotta is barely a character in that movie. No, it actually comes from the 1943 Phantom, where Carlotta Biancaroli so hates Christine that she just wants to get her out of the way. So there is a conflict between them in this movie, and several other versions of Phantom use this same sort of setup, but the rivalry and hatred between the two women are pretty much birthed from this exact scene. Next, we get a great little scene where Claudine confronts Biancaroli in her dressing room and murders her. Anatole chases Claudine through the catwalks as Raoul chases Anatole. It's a great scene with lots of suspense. As we near the climax, Claudine pushes Anatole off the catwalks and almost to his death. Claudine sends the managers a letter demanding Christine must sing, and Raoul is convinced that they should open the opera and refuse to let Christine sing in order to drive Claudine out of hiding. Now you may say, isn't there a safer plan that doesn't involve putting a singer's life in jeopardy? And you're right, there actually is one. And Anatole is the one who thinks of it. Anatole and Raoul come to visit Christine and tell her about the opera reopening. Again, the power of the bromance must not be denied.
I'm going out.
My carriage is outside.
Well, I'm not going right now.
I'll wait.
Anatole has his own plan to lure Claudine out of hiding by enlisting Franz Liszt. There he is again. What is with this movie's obsession with Franz Liszt? Well, Anatole plans to have Liszt play Claudine's concerto at the opera. Now, here's an interesting thing. When they cut out the subplot about Claudine being Christine's father, it leaves a couple of moments that just kind of hang there, suspended, with nothing to lead you into them. And I think that's probably because just a couple scenes got cut from this movie. You see, there's several reasons to think that Anatole would have been the one who would give the grand reveal that Claudine is Christine's father. And one of those reasons is Anatole just seems to know that the Phantom and Claudine are the same person. That's never really confirmed by anybody. In fact, everybody else thinks that Anatole or Christine may have been the one to murder Biancaroli because they're the only ones with motive. My guess is there's a couple of scenes that show Anatole turning detective and finding out that Claudine is the Phantom and putting together, oh, the lullabies, the bust, the obsession with Christine, he's not in love with her, he's her long-lost father. I'm not basing it just on that weird moment where Anatole suddenly has a plan to catch the Phantom. There is one other scene at the very end that to my mind is completely inexplicable if Anatole is not the one who would have given the grand reveal at the end. But we'll get to it in just a second. Now we get, in my opinion, the most exciting sequence of the whole film. The scene starts off with the chandelier in the foreground. Again, remember the iconic chandelier fall from Chaney's film was only 18 years earlier and was already one of the most iconic moments of horror cinema. So people were waiting for that chandelier to fall, and they do not disappoint, ladies and gentlemen. But even if this is your first Phantom, you'd get the idea because of the grammar of the scene, which shows the chandelier as the biggest and first thing in the scene, which makes it the most important thing in the scene. After killing one of the undercover cops and becoming the first Phantom to strangle or lasso someone on screen, a surprisingly rare honor despite the fact that the Phantom's MO in the book is lassoing and strangling, Claudine climbs up to the top of the auditorium. As the opera sequence goes on, Claudine sneaks up above the house and begins to saw through the chandelier chain. Now just check out this sequence of the chandelier falling. It's as if a Jim Cameron movie just took over for like 10 seconds. Gosh, that is awesome. Claudine abducts Christine, with her thinking he's one of the undercover police officers. He keeps calling her, my child, dear child, little one. See, this is another example of great map painting. Rather than setting up a platform so that they could build a set with a flight of steps going down to the lower layer, instead they just shot the characters in front of a doorway, shot the characters in a separate pass at the bottom with the camera up in the air, probably on a crane, and then bridged the two shots together with a map painting. Claudine takes Christine to his lair, and here's where the Phantom has all of his best lines.
You'll love it here when you get used to the dark. And you'll love the dark, too, The music comes down and the darkness distills it, cleanses it of the suffering that made it. And it's all beauty.
Anatole has the orchestra start playing Claudine's concerto, and Raoul tells him that Christine is missing. Together the two men go to find her. As Eric Claudin hears his concerto being played on the stage of the opera, he begins to play the piano down in his lair alongside it. Here we get a vague realization from Christine that the concerto is based on her lullaby. They don't oversell this, and I'm guessing they probably would have shown more of her reactions in the original cut. Christine sings along to Claudine's playing, and her whole demeanor briefly changes to more intrigued than fearful. As she sings, we get a build-up to the unmasking. This obviously is an homage to the Chaney film, and although not as good as the Chaney film, it is a pretty good unmasking. And it's made even better by the context. Look at the pride in Claudine's eyes. This is what he's waited for, to play their lullaby again, reunited with her singing along. It's almost like he's got his family back for a brief moment, which makes it all the more tragic when this interrupts it. I love how the camera loses focus for a second as they pan in. It's reminiscent of the Chaney film, where during the unmasking, the cameraman loses focus for a second. Now remember, Eric Claudin did receive a full face full of acid. However, only half of his face is burned. You may be wondering why. What it really seems to come down to, from what I understand, is that Claude Rains had really worked since his days as the Invisible Man to establish himself as a leading man, and he definitely was that. And he was worried that for audiences to see him in full burn makeup all over his face would damage his popularity, or even lead to him being typecasted as a horror actor, much as people like Lon Chaney Jr. were typecasted, or even Bela Lugosi. He probably made a good move in that sense, because career-wise, he was never typecasted for horror roles, although he did play several. So, I guess you have to kind of take that into account. Is it worth it that we didn't get as good of a deformity, that it kind of creates a little hole in the movie, in order that Claude Rains' career was guaranteed a bit more safety? To me, that was worth the trade, because Claude Rains is one of my favorite actors, and the more that we got to see him in, the better as far as I'm concerned. I did mention that there's a scene towards the end which makes no sense. It's completely inexplicable as far as I'm concerned, if we don't have that twist ending where I think Anatole would have been the one to reveal that Claudin was Christine's father. Right when Raoul has the Phantom at gunpoint, Anatole just grabs Raoul's arm and pushes it up, causing Raoul to miss the shot. Now, I've always thought this was related to the idea that Anatole may have been the one to reveal the truth about Claudin's familial relation, and that he stopped Raoul in order to spare Christine's feelings. Now, here's the thing. You might disagree with me on that. You may even find something to prove that Anatole wasn't the one who was going to make the reveal, or that Anatole didn't know that Eric was Christine's father. But here's the thing. Without that, it seems like Anatole just turned traitor, was on the Phantom's side, and betrayed Raoul for no reason, causing him to not shoot the guy who has murdered several people at this point. So it kind of messes up all of Anatole's character, and the fact that Raoul never addresses it also kind of messes with Raoul's character. It's just an odd little moment. And again, I have to think this is related to the subplot that was cut out, because otherwise, I just don't know what would explain this little moment. Either way, Raoul misses the shot, and the shot triggers an avalanche effect, which causes the layer to collapse on top of Claudin and encase him forever. The little tableau of Eric's mask and violin are a brilliant image. Actually, one of my favorite images in all Phantom lore. It's kind of a shame they didn't end the movie on this image, however. The ending is good. I like the ending, but I feel almost like they should have come back to this shot for the end credits. So in the epilogue, Christine arrives in her dressing room after a show, and notice that her attitude has completely changed.
Oh, mademoiselle, you are magnificent tonight. Thank you, Celeste. I was good, wasn't I?
In fact, she almost even uses the same dialogue as Bianca Rolli.
Madame was magnificent tonight.
I was good, wasn't I?
it kind of makes you think maybe Christine is kind of going the same direction, that she's going to be a diva herself. By the way, that's not incidental, and you'll see what I'm talking about. Christine suggests that Anatole, Raoul, and herself all go out to dinner together since they both asked her out.
Christine.
You two know each other, of course.
Of course.
Oh, Raoul, Anatole, will the rubber band of tension ever break between you two? When the two men give her an ultimatum, you have to choose one of us, Christine, we're done with all these games, Christine just leaves. You could see this as Christine actually choosing her operatic career over family life and ultimately rejecting them both, which is how I've always seen it. Although her sly smile could also leave you with the impression that this love triangle will go on through the ages. And the following little bit of dialogue could also give you that impression. Either way, we end on the film's true pairing, the real couple that this film clearly wanted to be together.
Would you join me for a bit of supper at the Café de l'Opéra?
With pleasure, monsieur.
After you, monsieur.
After you, monsieur.
I like to think that this is the beginning of an epic bromance for the ages, where Anatole and Raoul become best friends. I'm old-fashioned. I like best friends who are born out of weird situations, like The Odd Couple. I could see these guys forming a Holmes and Watson-like brotherhood and going around all of Paris solving mysteries. Overall, the 1943 Phantom is one of the very, very best, and despite being the second Universal Phantom movie, and not having as much pop cultural influence as the Chaney film, it's still considered the Universal Monster Phantom. In fact, in my Universal Monsters box set, the Phantom DVD only comes with one Phantom, and that Phantom is the 1943 version with Claude Rains. It's the most lavish, high-budget version in my opinion, and has a brilliant, classic movie charm to it, with an entire cast of charismatic actors and a wonderful script, brought to life by a breathtaking score. It's definitely one to see. Some people understandably might have an issue with the fact that it's more about the opera and the singers than it is about the Phantom. That never bothered me though, because unlike most versions, the non-Phantom-y bits are with characters I really like, and their storylines are interesting, so I never mind when the Phantom's not on screen. I'm an opera fan, and a fan of both Susanna Foster and Nelson Eddy as singers. So to me, the opera scenes are a great listen. Claude Rains is one of my favorite actors, and he makes a great Phantom. Again, Arthur Lubin shows himself to be a fine director with a real flair for visual storytelling. I recommend it because it's a good segue into the films, which the more you watch, the more you'll see, rarely have anything to do with the book, even in its basic plot. If you're an Andrew Lloyd Webber fan, you should know that the musical is quite a good adaptation of the book's basic story, at least where the love triangle element is concerned, and has a similar redemptive ending. Most of the films do not have any of these elements. So if you've not watched many of the films before, I'd recommend the 43 version as one of your first versions to watch, primarily because it's a very gentle approach to departing from the source material. Its influence is probably the reason most other versions never felt the need to stay close to the book. However, it's a much gentler approach than most of the later films, which are so different they may as well just not have even given credit to Gaston Leroux in the titles. So this is definitely one I recommend you check out. Thank you everybody for watching, God bless you, and I will see you in the next one.